So immediately following the 1940s is going to be when the 1950s brought the time of the golden age. So this was the time period where you were expected to be the breadwinner. If you were the husband, you were expected to be a wife. You were expected to have children, stay at home, take care of your husband, take care of your children, and take care of the house. So we're going to see some changes in the ways that people were living, commuting, suburbs, interstates, and child rearing. So some of the historic things that took place during the 1950s, the polio vaccine was founded. Lots of people were getting very sick and crippled from polio. If you've seen certain generations, they have marks on their arms where the polio vaccine actually left a mark. Brown versus the Board of Education fought for the rights for children of all races to be able to go to any school. Elvis was a big deal in the 50s. Sputnik kind of made us kind of kick our butts and get into gear with space technology. And then Rosa Parks when she refused to give her seat up on the bus. So we see some things in the 50s kind of triggering movements that continued throughout the 60s when we get there as well. So this is your birth rates. So as we can see, they dip significantly in the Great Depression. And then we can see there's a boom right here in the mid-1940s, which would be attributed to the war. And then during the 50s, you can see we stayed up pretty high. Pretty large amount of children being born during the 1950s, going along with the whole you're expected to have children and be a parent. This is teen birth rates, and as I've told you before, make sure you always look at the numbers. So these are looking at 15 to 19-year-olds. Again, big difference between a 15-year-old and a 19-year-old having a baby. So we're right here during the 50s, so you can see that we had pretty high rates of teen birth rates during this time. But again, I would question this ages, basically. So during the 1950s, marriage reached an all-time high in the United States. The time of marriage did decrease. So an average woman was getting married when she was around 20. We continued, as you've seen from the charts, to have a lot of babies. Women were not getting an education or going out and getting jobs. Again, for the most part, they were home caring for their kids. So as I said before, if you were single during the 50s, you were considered savage. There was something wrong with you. And they attribute it to these 5 things. Failure to marry would be because you were homosexual. So that would be attracted to the same sex, which during this time was not an acceptable way of life, at least not openly. You were either immature or you had infantile fixations. So you basically refused to grow up, or you were fixated on something according to Freud. That's a whole other conversation. You were irresponsible and unwilling to become responsible. You had some type of narcissistic trait that really only made you concerned about excelling in your career. You weren't concerned about family. And then deviant physical characteristics would be something abnormal about you. Deviant doesn't necessarily mean like ugly or bad. Deviant would just be something apart from the norm. So maybe you were like 10 feet tall or something like that. There was a huge belief during the Golden Age, during the 50s, that you had to be married in order to be happy. We now know that that's not true, but that is the belief and the mindset that was taking place during America during that time. So here's looking at your population by age during 1950. So you can see we had a lot of kids under the age of 5, and we start to see it kind of trickle through here. A lot of people not over the age of 75 or 80. We know that during the 1940s, the economy bounced back. Family income during the 50s actually rose by 20%. We started to see the housing shortage to be eliminated. 31 million families own their own home. If you think back to industrialization in the working class family, to own your own home was really a sense of security, and it was pretty rare. So now here we've come a few decades later, and a lot of people are owning their own home, continuing to have children, lots and lots of children. So your first, basically your first little community, your suburbs being built outside of town, was an idea by a man named William J. Levitt. This was referred to as Levittown. These houses basically were all exactly identical. They were made on a production line. They had the same floor plan, and they were just all put up pretty quickly. You could get a brand new house for $7,000 with no money down, no basement. I believe it had 4 rooms. Yeah, it did, 4 rooms. And if you were a veteran, you actually could get a really low interest rate from the VA, programs that are still available to veterans now. We were able to have suburbs and have people living outside of the cities and commuting in and out of work due to the changes with advances in automobiles, more families owning a car, and then also having highways for quicker transportation. Because of this, men would be commuting and they would be away from the home a little more. This led to like a desperate housewife kind of thing. Maybe your kids were at school and you were just home. A lot of times, again, your family only had one car, so you didn't necessarily have it. These houses got sold and bought quite a bit. There was a lot of turnover because people were climbing the corporate ladder and moving for higher positions or a different position within their jobs. Filiarchy is actually the term. We've said patriarchy, matriarchy, and we've had egalitarian before. But filiarchy is going to be when it's more about the family and the children dominating the household. So thinking about companionate family era when people were friends, the couples were friends, we were pals with our kids. That's kind of the mindset that took place during the 50s. More partnerships within the marriage, but not equality. A lot of gender roles, very stereotypical. One of the sources I read came up with 18 major household jobs, basically, and 3 of them were done by men. So that would say 15 were being done by women, which would make sense if the women were home. But the 3 that were being completed by men were what I would say typical, stereotypical male jobs. Locking up the house at night, which would be providing that sense of security for the family, fixing things that were broken, and then doing yard work. This always gets students usually in the classroom, their faces just drop. So if your husband was trying to get a job, they would actually interview the wife to see if she was socially acceptable, basically, to be on the arm of her husband for their corporation. And if the wife wasn't, then the husband wouldn't get the job. We've read this before. This was how to be a good wife. I've read this to you. We've talked about it before, but I included it again. This was being published in magazines during the 1950s. One of the most influential people during this time period with regards to child rearing was Dr. Spock. You can Google him. He's pretty famous. He really just said that you know more than you think you do about raising kids. A lot of parents were very afraid of some of the things that they had learned from Sigmund Freud, and they were trying to figure out exactly what that guy was even talking about. And Spock kind of just said, you just need to chill out. Like, focus on your kids, chill out on your discipline, give them some space, and mostly mothers were in charge. You can watch this link about him. These are some of the games that came out during the 50s. Candyland we still play. Mr. Potato Head looks different now. You guys get an actual plastic potato. That's a piece of styrofoam where you actually would replace it with a real potato. Silly Putty is very much around, and so is Yahtzee. So we're getting into eras where we're playing games that are things that you and I grew up with as well, which is pretty cool. This was a time period where they started to market to kids. So advertisements in magazines, as you can see, and flyers in the newspaper or mailers being sent out, trying to get more kids' attentions. If you look at the Toys for Boys and Girls ad, you can see that they're very gender stereotyped during this period too. We talked about Alfred Kinsey before, and he had 2 very famous publications, one of them on men and one of them on women. The one on women came out in 1953, and it was extremely informative, because pretty much what they found out is what women were saying about their sex lives was not what we were thinking or what was being portrayed publicly. Half of the women in his study admitted to having sex before marriage. A third of those women said they had been with 2 or more men. Remember, this is a time period where you're supposed to be saving yourself for marriage. And 25% of the women in the study admitting to having extramarital sex. So that would be cheating on their partner. And then also with regards to a sexual movement kind of starting, and we see it snowball more in the 60s, was the first issue of Playboy came out, and that's Marilyn Monroe on the cover. Songs and movies, I Love Lucy, this is Leave It to Beaver, Elvis, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, the original song you probably grew up singing. I think this is the Ronettes, but I can't remember. James Dean was a big deal, and of course Marilyn Monroe. As I said before, when we looked at the beginning timeline, State Board of Education ruling that school segregation was banned, and then Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat on the bus. And both of these things helping launch the civil rights movement that we see going throughout the 50s and the 60s. Teen culture, this one moves. I love it. That's so cool. What you think of as being a typical 50s scene from a movies with teenagers is exactly what it was. Going to the drive-in, going to the shop for milkshakes, wearing Letterman jackets, going on double dates. And then your book says parking. It cracks me up. So that's Making Out, guys. Catcher in the Rye actually was released. This is one of the banned books. You should read it, considering the time period that it came out. It's pretty, I can see why it was controversial, for sure. Anyway, lots of juvenile delinquency taking place. Adolescent homicide rate doubled in New York City, seeing an increase of gang activity, and just a lot of teenagers out on the streets and doing some bad stuff. However, the government came up with their Mobilization for Youth program to try to get kids off the street, give them some job training. And this became part of the war on poverty, which continued in the 60s with Lyndon B. Johnson. One of the other stories that's extremely important to make sure you guys are aware of was the killing of Emmett Till. You've probably heard of this before. If not, be sure to take some notes, please. Emmett was a young African-American boy who was accused of whistling at a white woman in a store. The woman's family then went and killed him. The picture is a horrific death. I won't go into the details. The picture on the right is actually Emmett in his open casket. His mother wanted the nation to see exactly what had been done to her son and the horror that he had endured. So again, this was the summer of '55. The white woman that accused him of whistling at her, actually came out a few years ago and said that she was lying, that it never actually happened. So this was an extremely tragic event, and kind of also helped fuel the civil rights movement and brought the nation to its knees, as you can see. Horrifying images. The Rosenbergs were executed for being spies. The story that goes along with this is these were husband and wife. He actually did it. She didn't. And then there was another guy who was involved, and he didn't want, it was her brother. Her brother was also involved, but he didn't want his wife to be in trouble, so he lied and threw his sister under the bus, I believe. So both of these two, this was a married couple. Again, he was involved, and I believe she was innocent, were executed for being spies. Like I said in the beginning, Sputnik, so we started trying to keep up with other countries in their space movement. And then the polio vaccine, this little girl has polio. It's like a crippling, debilitating disease. We had the vaccine for that in 1962. So that's it for your 50s unit.